If you're hearing this, it's too late. No, this isn't some ghost story meant to spook you around a campfire. It's a warning, a desperate one. She's still out there. And if you see her, if you hear her, it's already over. I didn't believe it either. Thought it was all in my head, burnout from the job or a string of bad dreams. But some truths don't care if you believe in them. They wait, watching, hunting, and by the time you see them, you've already lost. It started like any other Monday, another gray morning in a gray office. I was a nobody at a company no one's ever heard of, drowning in spreadsheets and deadlines. My biggest problem was avoiding the sludge they called coffee in the break room. Then she walked in. The memory is burned into my mind, a flash of red against a sea of beige and gray. She didn't belong there, not in that dull, lifeless world. She moved like she owned the place, her heels clicking against the tile with a rhythm that made time itself stutter. And when she smiled, it wasn't warmth, it was control. Her name was Selene, or that's what she said. New marketing director. No one knew where she came from, and no one asked. Her first day, she didn't bother with introductions. She just walked in and started rearranging the air, as if we were all pieces on a chessboard only she could see. I should have known something was wrong. The way the office shifted around her wasn't normal. The guys tripped over themselves trying to impress her, their voices a little louder, their laughs a little forced. The women couldn't decide whether to befriend her or hate her. Even Mr. Grayson, our stoic boss, fidgeted when she was near, his usual confidence crumbling under her gaze. I chalked it up to charisma at first. We've all met people like that, magnetic, commanding, larger than life. But Selene, she was different, heavier, like a storm cloud that followed her everywhere, crackling with something just out of reach. At lunch, she'd sit with us in the break room, laughing at jokes and asking the kind of questions that made you feel important. But she never ate, not a single bite. I noticed her food stayed pristine, untouched, like even time didn't dare spoil it. And then there was the mirror. It was the kind of cheap mirror every office has, smudged and slightly warped. That I was washing my hands one afternoon when I saw her reflection out of the corner of my eye. Except it didn't move. Not at the same time she did. For a moment, it just stood there, staring at me, even after she walked out of the room. My stomach twisted, but I shook it off. Exhaustion, I told myself. Stress. Anything to explain what I'd seen. But that's when the cracks started showing. Small things at first. Arguments breaking out over nothing. People quitting without notice. And then there was Dave. Office clown, always ready with a joke or a story to lighten the mood. After Selene showed up, he changed. Got quieter, jumpy, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. One day he snapped. In the middle of a meeting, he stood up, pale and trembling. "I can't stay here," he said. "She's watching. She's always watching." He stormed out, leaving behind a desk full of papers and an email that simply read, "Get out while you can." I wanted to leave. God, I wanted to. But I told myself it was just Dave being dramatic. I had bills to pay. I couldn't afford to run from shadows. You ever feel like someone's watching you? Not just the uneasy feeling of being stared at from across a room. I mean the kind of watching that crawls under your skin, that makes your every move feel like part of someone else's plan. I didn't believe in things like that. Monsters, curses, watchers. But then Selene walked into my life, and I stopped believing in coincidences. I remember it too clearly. It was a Monday, one of those endless, coffee-deprived mornings where everyone's half awake and already counting down to Friday. I was zoning out in a meeting when the door opened, and she walked in. Her dress was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't just red, it was alive. The kind of red that made the gray walls and fluorescent lights feel dimmer just by comparison. It clung to her like a second skin, like it wasn't fabric but something that breathed with her. She didn't introduce herself, didn't need to. The air in the room shifted the moment she stepped inside. It was heavier, charged, like the oxygen had been replaced with something thicker, harder to inhale. And then she smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that told us we weren't meeting her. She was letting us see her, like everything in that room, including us, was already under her control. No one questioned her. Not her name, not her role, not where she came from. She was the new marketing director. That was all anyone needed to know. But the office changed around her. People who barely acknowledged each other before suddenly laughed at the same jokes competed for her attention. Even Mr. Grayson, our no-nonsense boss, started acting strange, nervous, out of his depth, and I couldn't stop watching her. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't look away. It started small, subtle, like how she never ate lunch but always sat with us, laughing, asking questions that seemed just a little too personal, or the way she hummed, soft, almost inaudible, but persistent. The tune clung to me like a memory I couldn't place. I'd catch myself humming it at home without realizing, even though I had no idea where I'd heard it. But the mirrors were the worst. There was a cheap mirror in the office bathroom, smudged, unremarkable. I barely glanced at it most days. But one afternoon, I saw her reflection while washing my hands, and it didn't move. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. She walked past, but her reflection stayed, just for a fraction of a second longer than it should have, long enough for my heart to seize, long enough for me to know it wasn't normal. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that I was tired, but after that, I started noticing other things. Dave was the first to crack. He'd always been the life of the office, but after Selene arrived, he changed. Got quieter, jumpier. One day, during a meeting, he stood up, his hands shaking. "She's not what you think she is," he said. "None of this is." Then he left, just like that. Later, we found his email. "She's watching. Get out while you can." It should have been my cue to leave, but I didn't. I told myself Dave was just stressed, overworked, and then one night I saw it. I was working late. The office was empty except for me and Selene. I passed her desk and saw her sleeves pushed up as she scribbled in a notebook. That's when I noticed the marks on her arms. At first I thought they were tattoos, intricate, swirling designs that seemed to dance under the fluorescent light. But tattoos don't glow. Tattoos don't move. I froze, staring, and then she looked up. Our eyes met, and for a moment, it felt like she wasn't just looking at me. She was inside my head. Her smile widened, sharp and knowing, like she could hear my thoughts. That was the moment I knew, whatever she was, it wasn't human. You won't believe me. Honestly, I don't blame you. If someone had told me this story, I'd have laughed, shrugged it off as a twisted office rumor. But you need to listen, because it's real, and it could happen to you. It started with an invitation, or maybe it was a command. Her voice was low, soft, but heavy with something I couldn't place. Dinner. My place. Tonight. Before I even realized it, I'd said yes. The word left my lips without my permission, like my voice wasn't my own. I told myself it was just dinner, just a colleague reaching out. But deep down I knew. This wasn't casual. It wasn't normal. Nothing about Selene ever was. The moment I stepped into her apartment, I knew I'd made a mistake. The smell hit me first. Not unpleasant, but overwhelming. Rich spices, heavy and intoxicating, with a faint metallic tang beneath it. Copper, blood. The room was nothing like I'd expected. It wasn't the sleek, minimalist space you'd picture for someone like her. Instead, it felt ancient. The walls were lined with shelves of books, old, weathered, their titles in languages I didn't recognize. Symbols were carved into the wood, stitched into the curtains, even etched faintly into the floorboards. They weren't decorations, they felt alive, watching. She was already seated when I entered, her silhouette framed by candlelight that flickered like it feared her. The table was set for two, but the food wasn't right, too perfect. The roast glistened unnaturally, and the vegetables almost glowed, their colors too vivid, too vibrant. It looked like art, not food meant for consumption. Selene gestured for me to sit, her smile as inviting as it was unsettling, and like a puppet on strings, I obeyed. I took a bite. It wasn't hunger, it was compulsion. The flavors weren't just tastes, they were memories. Not mine, but something ancient, something primal. I saw flashes, fire, chanting, shadowy figures reaching for the sky. The room spun, my senses overwhelmed, but I couldn't stop eating. She watched me the entire time. Not eating, not drinking, just watching. Her eyes never left mine, and the intensity of her stare felt like a weight pressing into my chest. It wasn't hunger in her gaze, it was possession. Then she spoke. "Do you believe in the soul?" The question hung in the air, suffocating. I tried to answer, but my throat tightened. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "What would you give to keep yours?" I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the question, but she didn't. Her smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp to belong in a human mouth. Her voice softened, almost sad. "I wasn't always like this," she said. "Once I was human. Once I was free. But curses don't care about what you want. They consume, they twist, they take." Her words cracked for the first time, her tone betraying something almost like regret. "I don't want to do this," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But the curse, it doesn't care. It only wants one thing, you." I wanted to run. God, I wanted to, but my legs wouldn't move. Her words held me in place, like chains binding me to the chair. She leaned closer, her smile now a predator's grin. "You're mine." I don't remember standing, I don't remember reaching for it, but there was a charm hanging on the wall, small and unassuming. The moment I grabbed it, I felt it hum in my hand, a vibration that shot through my body like a jolt of electricity. She screamed. It wasn't a human sound. It tore through the air, through my mind like jagged glass. Her form twisted, her features flickering between beauty and horror. Shadows rose from the floor, writhing and clawing, as if the apartment itself was alive and angry. I ran. The room distorted as I moved. The walls stretched, the symbols on the floor burned with blinding light. Her voice chased me, echoing through the space, venomous and unrelenting. "You can't escape me!" I burst through the door and into the night, the charm cutting into my palm as I clutched it like a lifeline. Her screams faded behind me, but I knew the truth. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. If you ever meet someone like her, if you feel that weight in the air, that pull you can't explain, don't stay. Don't hesitate, just run. Because once she has her eyes on you, there's no turning back. What if I told you there's something worse than death? It's not pain or fear, but something far more insidious, something that lingers, watching you, breathing with you, invading every moment until you can't even remember what life was like before it began. I'm not sure who I am anymore, not since her, not since the curse. It started with her eyes. Those eyes weren't human. The first time I noticed, I was in the break room. She walked in and the world seemed to ripple around her. Everything went still. Her gaze swept the room, and for a moment, our eyes locked. I felt it, a pull, a weight, as though she wasn't just looking at me, but through me. She saw everything I was, everything I'd ever tried to hide. Her smile curved, sharp and deliberate. It wasn't an expression, it was a warning. After that day, the office changed. People who once worked together like clockwork started snapping at each other over the smallest things. Arguments broke out over coffee orders, missing pens, even the thermostat. And then there was Dave. Dave had been our office clown, the guy who made sure no day was too heavy. But after Selene arrived, he became a shadow of himself, quiet, paranoid, always glancing over his shoulder. Then one morning he snapped. "She's not what you think she is," he shouted during a meeting, his voice trembling. "None of this is real." Before anyone could react, he stormed out. By the next day, his desk was cleared out, and the only trace of him was a message scrawled on the whiteboard. "She's watching." I should have left then, packed up my desk and walked away. But I didn't. I told myself it was just stress, just coincidence. That was my mistake. The first night it happened, I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. At first, I thought it was just a nightmare. But the feeling lingered, like the shadows in the room weren't just shadows anymore. Like they were alive, waiting, watching. I started seeing her everywhere, not just in the office, but in the corners of my vision, in reflections, in dreams that weren't just dreams. Her eyes haunted me, burning, endless, pulling me into an abyss I couldn't escape. And then there were the marks. One morning, they appeared. Faint but unmistakable. Thin lines carved into my skin, too precise to be scratches, too deliberate to be accidental. They glowed faintly, pulsing with my heartbeat. I tried washing them away, convincing myself they weren't real. But they stayed. They were part of me now. Desperate, I turned to Mrs. Johnson, the office's unofficial keeper of secrets. Older, quiet, and said to have seen things, she was my last hope. When I showed her the marks, she didn't look surprised. She nodded slowly, her face grim. "You've been marked," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The curse has claimed you." Mrs. Johnson told me what I didn't want to hear. The marks weren't random. They were symbols, ancient and binding. They weren't just on me. They were in me. I was tied to Selene now, tangled in the same dark web that had ensnared her. "She wasn't always like this," Mrs. Johnson said. She was cursed, twisted by betrayal and blood magic. And now she's bound to spread that curse to others. To survive, she has to take from you your soul, your essence, everything that makes you, you. Her words hit like a hammer, but it wasn't just fear that gripped me, it was despair. Deep down, I knew she was right. The marks weren't just a sign of the curse, they were a countdown. That night, I heard her voice for the first time outside of work. A whisper in the dark, soft but sharp enough to slice through my mind. "You think you can fight me?" she said, her tone mocking, laced with something dark. "You can't even fight yourself." Her words crawled inside me, wrapping around my thoughts like barbed wire. She wasn't just speaking to me, she was unraveling me, pulling at every fear, every doubt I'd buried away. And the worst part? She was smiling, always smiling. I didn't sleep after that. How could I? She was always there in the shadows, in the corners of my mind. I knew then what I'd been too afraid to admit. I couldn't escape her. Not without a fight, but the fight wasn't just against her. It was against the part of me she'd already claimed. The air was heavy, suffocating. I stood at the entrance of the old church, its crumbling walls shrouded in shadows. The wind outside howled like a warning, but inside there was only silence. A silence so deep it felt alive, pressing against my chest, making each breath a struggle. This was it. I had come too far to turn back, and she was here. I could feel her, just beyond the veil of reality, slipping between the cracks of existence, waiting. The wind stopped. The candles inside the church flickered weakly, their flames casting shadows that twisted and stretched unnaturally. The air grew thick with heat, but it wasn't warmth. It was oppressive, a suffocating weight that made my legs feel like lead. And then I heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of the wooden door behind me. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My body wouldn't obey. The door groaned open, inch by inch, until I saw her. At first, just a silhouette. Slender, graceful, but wrong, unnatural. And then she stepped into the room, and the light itself seemed to recoil from her presence. She moved like smoke, fluid and unbound, yet every step landed with the weight of inevitability. Her golden skin shimmered, alive with symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Her eyes, burning with fire, locked onto mine, and I felt my knees weaken. She wasn't just Selene anymore. She was something more, something worse. A predator cloaked in beauty, her smile sharp enough to cut. "You really think you can escape me?" she asked, her voice soft, almost tender, but each word dripped with venom. "You've already given me your soul. You just don't know it yet." Her words wrapped around me, cold and suffocating. I tried to step back, but it felt like the floor was holding me in place. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate, calculated, as if she were savoring the moment. "Everything you are," she continued, her eyes glowing brighter. "Everything you were, it's already mine." I clenched the charm in my hand, the one I'd taken from her apartment. It burned against my palm, but I held onto it like a lifeline. My voice shook as I whispered the first words of the chant Mrs. Johnson had given me. The words felt foreign, heavy, as if the air itself resisted them. Her smile faltered, just for a moment. Her eyes narrowed, and I saw the first flicker of something new. Anger. "You think that can save you?" she hissed, her voice sharp now, slicing through the stillness. "Do you have any idea what you're dealing with?" The room began to change. Shadows rose from the floor, writhing like living things, and the walls seemed to stretch, bending under the weight of her power. The symbols on her skin glowed brighter, pulsating like a warning. I kept going, my voice growing louder with each word. The charm in my hand vibrated, its hum growing stronger, resonating with the words. The light in the room flickered violently, as if the candles themselves were terrified of her. Her form began to shift. Her golden skin turned darker, molten, as if burning from within. Her beauty twisted into something monstrous. Her smile stretched too wide, her teeth jagged and sharp. The predator she'd always been was now fully revealed. "Stop," she screamed, her voice no longer human. Now it echoed, layered and distorted, shaking the very ground beneath me. The symbols on her skin flared with blinding light, and I could feel her power clawing at me, trying to pull me down. I screamed the final words of the chant, pouring everything I had into them. The charm in my hand burned white hot, and the room exploded with light. The walls cracked, the floor buckled, and her scream tore through the air, a sound that wasn't meant for human ears. Her body contorted, writhing as the symbols on her skin burned brighter and brighter. Then, with a final deafening crack, she was gone. The room fell silent, the shadows retreating, the air growing still once more. I collapsed to the floor, the charm slipping from my hand. The church was quiet now, the oppressive heat replaced by a cold stillness. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe, but something wasn't right. I looked around, expecting relief, but the silence felt wrong, too complete, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Had I won, or had I only delayed the inevitable? I thought it was over. I thought I was free. The curse was broken, Selene destroyed, or at least that's what I told myself as I walked away from the ruins of that church. But deep down I knew something wasn't right, knew she wasn't gone. The first sign was the dreams. They started the night after the confrontation. Vivid, inescapable, and more real than any nightmare had a right to be. She was there, of course, always watching, always smiling. Sometimes I'd see her in the distance, standing under a flickering streetlight. Other times she'd be closer, her reflection appearing in mirrors where she shouldn't be. Her eyes burned into me, even when I woke up gasping for air. Her voice hummed in the back of my mind, soft and low, the same haunting tune I tried so hard to forget. I thought it was just trauma, the aftershocks of everything I'd been through. But it wasn't just in my head. The shadows in my room were the next to change. At first they were just darker, heavier, as if the light couldn't quite reach them. But then they started moving, not flickering like normal shadows, moving with purpose, slithering across the walls like they were alive. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, my mind playing games. But then I saw her eyes in those shadows, burning, unblinking, staring back at me. One afternoon, I saw her, broad daylight, on a busy street, surrounded by people. She was walking alongside someone, a man I didn't recognize, laughing at something he'd said. Her smile was wide, charming, the way it had been on her first day at the office. My heart stopped. I told myself it wasn't her, that it couldn't be her. But then she turned. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I knew. Her smile shifted, slight, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A knowing curve of her lips, a silent acknowledgement. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her message was clear. She wasn't done. Not with me. Not with anyone. I thought I'd broken the curse. I thought I'd escaped, but I didn't understand it then. The curse isn't something you destroy. It doesn't end. It just moves on, changes, finds someone new. She wasn't gone. She never was. She was just waiting, biding her time, watching me from the edges of my life, creeping closer with every breath I took. If you're hearing this, it's already too late. You're already in her sights, whether you realize it or not. Maybe you felt it, that strange heaviness in the air, that sensation of being watched when no one's there. Maybe you've seen her. Maybe you will. All I know is this: you can't run from her. You can't hide, because she isn't just out there. She's in here now. The curse doesn't leave you. It doesn't fade. It doesn't stop. It becomes you. I've tried everything to escape, but I know now that I never will. She's in the shadows, in the corners of my mind, watching, waiting. So if you see her, if you feel her, don't stay. Don't think. Don't look back. Run. Run as fast as you can. Because once she has her eyes on you, it's already over.